Good evening, everyone. My name is Mariam Pera. I am the coordinator for the Weal group here in Chicago. It's wonderful to be with you all, and I hope you're all staying safe and warm. It's a minor blizzard here in Chicago, so I hope everyone's doing well. Very excited to welcome our speakers for this evening's event. We are honored to have some wonderful guests with us, but first and foremost, I want to say thank you to Peter Cunningham at the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union for keeping us moving, and the man behind the curtain. Also excited to welcome some of our guests from Commonweal Magazine. So just to start us off, I thought we might begin with the synodal prayer as a starting point. I've gone ahead and posted it in the chat, but I will go ahead and lead us in that prayer to begin. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to guide us, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, so that we may journey together to eternal life and not stray from the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the communion of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to our moderator for tonight's panel, Claudia Avila Cosnahan, who's the Director of Mission and Partnerships for Commonweal Magazine. All yours, Claudia.
Thank you, Mariam, and welcome to everyone again. Welcome to Commonweal's The Weal Synod Conversations series. Commonweal's The Weal is a community of young people and those who desire to be in dialogue with them, who seek to engage in conversations inspired by the Catholic intellectual tradition. The Catholic Church's Synod on Synodality has the potential to be the most transformative moment since Vatican II. Each conversation in our series puts in dialogue two of the Synod on Synodality's 10 themes through the experience and expertise of leaders throughout the nation, towards a more just, inclusive vision for the Church. We'd like to thank the Chicago Theological Union St. Bernardine Center's local Weal community for being our host for this series. These videos will be made available online as a collection after our live events. Today's two themes are dialogue in the Church and society and authority and participation. Joining us are Dylan Corbett, the founding director of Hope Border Institute, located in El Paso, Texas. Dylan formerly worked as a staffer to the bishops of the United States at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, CCHD, and the National Anti-Poverty and Social Justice Program of the USCCB. He has worked in the international development and nonprofit sectors in Washington, D.C., Central America, and South Asia, and has studied at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, Italy. Marisa Limón Garza is the Deputy Director of Hope Border Institute. Marisa has a wide array of experience and expertise. She has previously focused on integrated marketing campaigns, strategy, and Latino engagement at TKU Advertising in Austin and Albuquerque. Marisa also served as the Assistant Director of Community Engagement and Multicultural Outreach with the Austin Independent School District and held a variety of positions with the Hispanic Scholarship Consortium. Marisa began her career as a classroom teacher in Catholic schools through the Alliance for Catholic Education. She holds a master's in education and bachelor's in English and Spanish literature from the University of Notre Dame, along with a certificate in nonprofit management from Georgetown University. Finally, Griffin Oleynick is an assistant editor at Commonweal Magazine, where he also writes about religion and the arts. Originally from Philadelphia, he holds a PhD in Italian literature from Yale University and lives in Manhattan. So we'll begin our evening together in conversation with Dylan Corbett and Marisa Limón Garza from Hope Border Institute, El Paso, Texas, to share a reflection on the Synod theme, Dialogue in the Church and Society.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Really, really good to be with all of you and the Weal community, and really appreciate the invitation to be with you today. Marisa and I are both with the Hope Border Institute, and we are located at a very unique place on the US-Mexico border. It's a place that's at the crossroads. It's a place of crossroads. It's a place of convergence. We're at a place that for centuries and centuries has been a place of communication, of commerce, of movement north and south. We're on the border, and we're also all the way in West Texas. So we're also the gateway to the Southwest. So a place of connection between East and West coasts, between the South and the Southwest. And because of that unique place that we occupy, we occupy also all those great arcs of history and movement. Abarcamos toda esa historia, todo ese arco de movimiento. And it's a story that continues today in the drama of the movement of peoples that continues across our border with all its joys, with all its challenges. And I think that's something that when we're thinking about synodality, that this human drama that we're in the midst of focuses for us is the moral choice that comes with encountering the other. What is cómo me ubico, mi autocomprensión ante el rostro del otro? Do I see the other as a threat? Do I see the other as competitor, as someone or something to be feared, or as an invitation to solidarity and to transformation? The wisdom that comes, I think, from the spirit on the border is this, that diversity and difference are not insuperable challenges, but are gifts that enrich us. Faith, the Pope says in his document, the document that he signed with the Grand Imam on human fraternity, he says, faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or a sister to be supported and loved. And I think that's the culture of encounter that the Pope is trying to promote. And you very much see that in the history and in the moral challenges here on the border. Now, the church has a complex and a very human history. At her worst, the church has been complicit in the injustice that's marked this region with its history of racism, with its history of white supremacy, the inability to see difference as gift. But at her best, the church has also recognized that movement of the spirit that's here, has received that wisdom of this region, has been changed and transformed by that encounter for the better. And I think the church on the border is at her best as a Samaritan church that attends to wounds. Here you see the diversity too of the people of God, the diversity of the gifts and the needs that are in the church, because here there are people on the move. This is a place of human mobility. Here the church is both the people of God in movement, on the way, in a very incarnate way, in a concrete way, in the lives and the hopes and the joys and the aspirations of vulnerable people who are on the move, a church that walks together. But the church here is also a way station, a place of stability, of prayer, of comfort, of strength for those who are on the way. At her best, the church has been able to accompany those who are on the way and to learn and to be the way station too. And I think the church needs to be both. And I think that's a lesson that can be shared with the rest of the church. Marisa?
Thank you, Dylan, and thank you all for having us with you this evening. It's an honor and a privilege. one of the components that we think about when it comes to this synod on synodality is paying attention to topics that might sometimes be overlooked. And part of our reality is being part of a border church and having that be recognized in our particular case of a border theology, and how that is reflected back in some of the realities in our community, which specifically highlight US immigration policy towards migration and what we see at the southern border. So during the synodal process, it's not enough for us to contemplate and listen to and think about topics that are close at hand, but to push ourselves. In many ways, El Paso, as Dylan so well articulated, exists in a bubble of sorts. We're in a remote area. We are in a desert. We are held off by mountains and somewhat remote from a lot of other major metropolitan areas. And there's a beauty in that, and there's a challenge in that. And there's also the reality that some of this is demarcated through a militarized response. And so if you were to drive from your home to our community, you would pass through Border Patrol checkpoints. If you were to have the capacity to visit a port of entry, you would see walls and razor wire where a welcome mat might be in other communities. You might see and hear drones and helicopters overhead monitoring movement. And these are the ways that we've done our work to try to control and to deter so much of the people that we see on the move. And so when we think about issues and topics that need to be addressed, the voices of people on the move and people impacted by our immigration policies so desperately need to be part of that. Our policies have been one of deterrence and even through extreme cruelty and violence towards people that based on our gospel values are inherently human, inherently divine, and are the reflection of ourselves. And if our policies are the reflections of our values, as a people of faith, we know that we're woefully out of step when it comes to immigration in particular, and in the many manifestations of that large umbrella of a policy, whether it be citizenship, whether it be other processes for people seeking asylum, people that are currently in immigration detention. All of these components are reflections of who we are, what we believe in, what we value. And therefore, as a church, we must wrestle with that. And we must create systems that are much more in line with who we are and who we plan to be, and how we can make that manifest today. So much of our work here at the Hope Border Institute is really looking at the human impact of these policies and the toll that it takes on real people, whether it be people on the move, families, individuals, small children, whether it be the officers and agents that support the system and infrastructure, whether it be the people providing hospitality and care, and the people that are even taking advantage of the situation and even profiting. So it's incumbent upon us to have these important dialogues and to seek the understanding of the pain and the trauma through active listening, through engagement. You can see that through some of our own efforts that we've undertaken when it comes to research and reporting, and the analysis that we've done on the impact of policies like Title 42, which is basically cutting off access to the right to seek asylum. We, the United States, have committed to be part of upholding a concept of non-refoulement, not returning people to danger where we know that they will be persecuted. And we're in opposition to that every day at the southern border. Every single day, we are turning people away from their chance to seek refuge, to seek support, and go through systems and processes. And oftentimes those same systems are built on this idea of scarcity, that there's not enough to go around. And as people of faith, we know through the loaves and the fishes that there's abundance. We know that we have plenty. And who, if not we, in the United States and this US Catholic Church, does not have what it takes to meet the needs and to be present. And so it's an opportunity for us to enter into that. We are also seeing the return of another policy called Remain in Mexico, or the Migrant Protection Protocols. Again, nothing to do with protecting migrants, and instead exporting our commitments to asylum processing south of the border. You may have heard in the news that we're now sending people from Venezuela to Colombia. We're sending people away. You likely have seen images of how we treated Haitian migrants in Del Rio, Texas. And you've seen the violent history of the way that it connects so deeply to our racist past and racist present. And so we beseech all of you and our own communities to include this in your thoughtfulness and prayerfulness when it comes to the Synod on Synodality, and to look to the margins, to look to the periphery for that encounter, for that dialogue that's so woefully needed, and to move outside of the bubbles that we live in and try to see things from other perspectives and be open to be made new from those encounters. I'll send it over to Dylan.
Thanks. A few concluding words on dialogue in the church. You've heard how our border communities are suspended between multiple injustices. What we've tried to do at Hope is to raise the walls that hem us in, that have been constructed for us, or that we have internalized and created ourselves, whether it's the walls that divide us, church, north and south, walls of geography, society, clergy, and laity, et cetera, et cetera. We desperately need people of faith who are willing to take risks and who can serve as bridges between church and the poor, between factions, between church and society, between church and movements for justice. Not dialogue for dialogue's sake, but something that's transformational, something that's mutually transformational, something that brings us into right relationship with one another, and in service of justice. I think we also need a church that's unafraid to be critical of the culture, critical of structures of oppression. It's not standing apart from the rest of the church, rest of the culture rather, for the sake of being different. No, in the North American context, that happens a lot in the church, and it's usually at the cost of non-participation in the struggle for human dignity. But we need a critical stance because the church is in vital contact with the poor, because the church is announcing the values of the kingdom, justice and fraternity and solidarity, and is denouncing injustice, the anti-kingdom walls. The greatest need that we see today in the church, and this is what we try to do at Hope, in order to have a critical dialogue between church and society, culture and the church, is to have interpreters, to be interpreters and ambassadors between both worlds, to be bridge people. And I think that's the lesson of the border. People willing to engage in that messy encounter, people willing to lower themselves in service of justice. In the US church, the synodal process can feel a little messy and conflictual at times, but I think it can also be a kairos moment, a moment of grace where we realize our power to be, to act as bridge people, and help reveal the horizon of God in everyday life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan and Marisa. As we said at the beginning, one of our hopes is to place experience and themes in dialogue. And so I invite us all to contemplate what Dylan and Marisa have brought forth for us, and to keep that kind of in a little bit in suspense within our minds as we now listen to Griffin Oleynick, who will now reflect on the Synod theme, authority and participation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to speak a bit as a journalist, as an editor at Commonweal, but also from my own autobiographical experience. And I hope it will it'll link up to some of the themes that we just expressed: weakness, vulnerability, that sort of thing. So the first thing to say about the Synod on Synodality is I think that it suffers perhaps from the use of an unfortunate word, synodality, to express a really good concept. I think you hear the word synodality a lot, where we really, even after all of these years that Francis has been pushing it, we really don't have a very good definition of it. We don't have a good grasp of what it means. We have a sense that there are aspects of synodality that we like. The Pope talks about frank discussion, right? That's one of the things that's supposed to be happening. Parousia, he calls it in Greek. And that's part of it, but that's not the whole thing. The left or the American Catholic left has tended to associate it with anti-clericalism, or the idea that the laity might suddenly be in charge. That's not really it either. That's not what Francis means by synodality. Historically, a synod is a decision-making body among hierarchs in a church. And in the Catholic Church, the tradition was revived after the Second Vatican Council, but we still have to remember that it's officially the Synod of Bishops. That's its official name. So it's not any kind of lay thing happening. It's a hierarchical structure. And we have to remember too that we've had a series of synods so far. We had the Synod on the Family in 2015. We had the Synod on Young People in 2018, which I was present at to cover for Commonweal. In 2019, we had the Synod on the Amazon, and now we have the Synod on synodality. And so it's part of a long process that's still taking place. The media of which I am a part tends to focus on takeaways, and these are usually around neuralgic points. For instance, in 2015 Synod on the Family, the big question was whether Francis's agenda was to relax restrictions and allow divorced and remarried Catholics to return to communion. Or in 2019, where the focus was on indigenous communities in the Amazon, the media speculated about whether Francis was trying to permit married priests in Roman Catholicism. And these questions are important, but they totally miss the point. There's something bigger that Francis has in mind, an idea that's much more spiritual and, in fact, I would argue less institutional. It helps for me to think of it as Pentecost. It's an experience of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. It's also an experience of fellowship and community, similar to what happened or what we read about in Acts of the Apostles, what happened with the early church. Clearly, Francis thinks that that's something that's missing from today's Catholic Church, and that's why he's called the Synod on Synodality. He uses often metaphors like rekindle or reinfuse. And Claudia and I talk about this a lot, but I did a lot of camping during the pandemic. And so in order to build a campfire, if you've ever done this, you realize that in order to build a fire, you actually have to start with the smallest pieces of wood and kindling available. You don't use the big logs, you don't use the structure, you actually use the smallest, most flammable pieces that are available. So if you follow the metaphor, it's really the smallest things that are supposed to catch fire. We're thinking about it kind of backwards. We think the church needs to reform itself from above. Francis is saying, as the person at the top, well, actually, no, that's the exact opposite of how it works. Etymologically, so to look at the origin of the word, synodality and synod itself comes from the Greek, two words, a prefix sun, which means together, and hodos, which means road. And this is something that journalists and scholars repeat to death, but it's worth saying again, because we keep forgetting it, that synodality means walking along the same road together. Francis repeats the metaphor all the time, and I think it's a good one. I forget exactly where it was, but I think he talks about it it's either Fratelli Tutti or one of the other synodal documents, but he talks about the road to Emmaus story as a crucial kind of touchstone for getting at what he means. And remember what happens there is that it's after the crucifixion, Jesus has been buried, the disciples are distraught, they're walking to Emmaus and a stranger draws near. And the point of the story is not that they don't recognize it's Christ. The point is that they go from being grief-stricken to being inflamed, that their hearts were burning. They said it wasn't true that our hearts were burning within us. So that's the movement that Francis wants to effect. It's not a question of doctrine. It's a question of spirit, or we might say orientation. Synod is also, I think, related, this just occurred to me as I was thinking about this, but it's related to the term exodus, has the same root word, right? So that's a going out from. So a synod is kind of a synodus, right, in Latin, is kind of an exodus. And I really think that Francis, that's what he's trying to get us to be, a less kind of hidebound, rule-oriented, rigid institution, and one that's more inflamed with the Spirit. So without being an expert on synodality, I will say that I think I do have, and we all have, if we're here, if we're believers, some experience of synodality that we've had in our own life, even if we don't identify it as such. For me, it's something that happened in graduate school. As Claudia mentioned, I did a PhD in Italian at Yale. And my home there for many years was St. Thomas More, which is the Catholic chapel and center. And that's where I really, I could say, experienced synodality, or I came to know myself as a person who exists in relation with other people, with other Catholics. There were great programs, so we had professors give talks, we had soup kitchen, we have whatever you want in campus ministry. But the most important part I found for myself was the existence of small church communities. Maybe some of you have joined them or talked about them. They were a movement that started with ecclesial-based communities in Latin America. They actually kind of died off in popularity, but they still existed where I was at Yale. And the point is, it's a little bit more than Bible study. You do the readings together, but each week you meet with a small group of peers. With me, it was other graduate students across various disciplines, and you talk about your faith lives. And this sounds like, well, of course we should be doing this, but this is actually the core of the church. Like this is, we had a mentor who passed away, the pastor there used to say that this is in fact what the future of the church is, that the Sunday assembly, that's not church, that's a church of churches. And the small church community where you are church for each other and where you come to discern your life's path, what you think you're called to, that's really the heart of it. So for me, I sort of, in graduate school, that was what I did, or that was who I was. And it led me eventually at the end to try to become a monk. I joined a community in Italy, and that's where I had the opposite experience, or what I like to call the opposite experience of synodality. So the community I joined, I won't go into it. If you want to learn about it, you can read an article that I wrote for Commonweal. But I was a novice. I experienced abuse, partly sexual abuse at the hands of my novice master. This was back in 2015, before Pope Francis and I forget which dicastery it was, but they actually modified the Code of Canon Law to sort of take account of young religious information. Now, Claudia said I was going to be speaking about power and authority. And you remember, there's a point in the gospel where the people are drawn to Jesus and they say, here's one that speaks with authority. Power and authority are very different things when I think about my experience. The person who was in charge of my formation had ecclesial power over me, and that was what he sort of used to bring about an abusive situation. But he had no authority. I mean, what had authority was my prior experience in the small church communities. And so that was what enabled me to resist the abuse, to go home, to leave, to heal, to recover, eventually to find my way to Commonweal. And I bring it up, not because I think I'm a special person, but just because it's, I think in my own mind, in my own spirituality, when I think of the church, I have these two different things. One was based on power, but the other spoke to me with authority and still does. So I guess I would say I'm grateful actually to be where I am now, in a position at Commonweal to observe as a writer and editor. And it's fortunate that we have in our name the common good. So Commonweal, people often ask, what does that mean? It comes from the idea of the common good. And why is this all related? Why do I bring it up in the context of synodality? I think that I often joke about this, but I think Commonweal, we're lay-led, so we're independent from the church. Our job is partly to sort of, interpret the news, give opinions. It's not really to give the liberal line on what's happening in Catholicism. That's often what we do. But I've always said that Commonweal is actually pretty similar to a religious community. And the more I think about it, there's a kind of innate synodality that happens at Commonweal. One tradition that we had going back years before the pandemic was we would eat lunch together every day, all of the editors and staff members. And it became sort of like a cultural phenomenon. Like, it doesn't sound like much. We just ate lunch together. Okay, who cares? But that's actually the point. Like, that's the ordinary human context in which God becomes manifest. If you think about the road to Emmaus, you only realize that it's Jesus after. You only realize that synodality is in fact happening, that you're journeying with other people after you're kind of in the middle of it. And I think that's sort of what the Pope is saying, is like, look, we should all admit that like things have actually gone pretty badly for us as a church. I would say, like, for me, it went badly. I like to joke about the monastery. It did not go well for me. Like, I experienced the worst that the church has to offer. And I don't have any sort of Pollyannish way of saying like, oh, but that's, you know, now my life is better. And it is, that's true, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't make what happened okay. But that's not the point. The point is not to forget our past. Dylan and Marisa were talking about the church's complicity in racism. That's never going away. We can't erase it. The church's complicity in the abuse crisis is never going away. The church's abandonment in many instances of people during the pandemic and its focus on its own power and power mind without authority, that's not going away either, unfortunately. And I know that that's not totally the case. So I think that the church has lost a lot of credibility. But I actually don't think that that's such a problem, because it's not really the church that needs to be credible. It's not the church that needs to have authority. It does in the end, but really it's Jesus. Pope Francis is a Jesuit. He centers Christ in everything he does and in his thought. And I think that's the invitation here, to realize that it's don't look to the church for reform. Don't look to, you know, the structures necessarily. Just begin doing good work. Like, see where the problems are, what Dylan and Marisa talked about, and begin working on them. So that's the shift, the kind of Emmaus shift that I think the Pope is getting at. And that's the end of my discourse.
Thank you, Griffin. I think you've already started to do this a little bit at the end of your sharing, but I'd like to invite you and Dylan and Marisa to comment on what you've heard thus far. What do you see any connections between the two themes and your two experiences? Or just in general, what are some things that you heard in the other that strike you as important for this conversation?
I'm happy to share something. I mean, I was really appreciating the analysis of power and authority. I know there was a comment in the chat about that as well. I think that is definitely something, when I spoke to militarized areas and this idea of what we see at the southern border, specifically what we see in all the United States, of who is an American, what is that power, what is not within that power, what is, and yet what's the authority within that guides us, what is the human connection and the human spirit that binds us up. And I think that's really something I want to take back and reflect on in my own life and in my own practice of faith. I just really appreciated that point.
Griffin, thank you for sharing a little bit of the story of your journey in religious life. I knew you before this meeting, but I didn't, and I had read that article, but I didn't realize you were the same person.
Oh, interesting.
And so that article, I remember, was very powerful, as was your candor right now. And it was clear to me that what you spoke about at the beginning, but about authority and power, was rooted in, I mean, I understand how now it's rooted in your experience, and that's very, yeah, I was quite moved by that. What I'm also moved by is that in everything you said, you were balancing, you were walking a balance. You were balancing between realism, what sounded to me like deep realism, and also hope. Now I understand where that deep realism comes from, the experience that you had in the monastery. You know, you started out by saying, hold on, this is really a synod of bishops. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. It was like deep realism. So there was deep realism throughout everything you said. And yet the hope, how you described what you do at Commonweal as being expression of who you are as a person of faith. Despite the experience that you had, you still persevere as a person of faith, and you see yourself and what you do as living that out, which gives me hope. Marisa and I had a meeting just a moment ago about the Synod in our border context, and I won't get into the details, but I confessed to my team that I felt in my heart this tension between realism, is this really going to go anywhere, and the hope and the promise that it contains, and I saw that reflected in you. So thank you for the hope that you give me, because it's clear that it's grounded in realism, and yet you persevere.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think of your own Marisa and Dylan, your analysis of I'm thinking back, we did a podcast together, and I think I asked a question about the Biden administration and whether you had hope for the Biden administration, and I guess I remember you having some deep realism too. I like that you use the word realism and not pessimism. Because there's a difference. Like pessimism says, well, we shouldn't even be bothering. Like nothing will change. Who cares? And I think it's easy. It's easy to be pessimistic. It's easy to think. I guess one thing I'll say, maybe this helps, is I have a Jesuit friend who, I was kind of consumed by this story of the abuse. I'm like, oh my God, people need to know. But he's like, that's not the most interesting thing about you. Like, you're not, this is, to be a victim, I think victims should be listened to. We should take victims seriously, but we should also realize that victims are not just victims. Like, we're not just the worst kinds of things that happen to us, or even the worst things that we do. And I guess it's the Synod, if I have any hope for it, like I was going to say that I was pessimistic. Maybe I did say, I don't remember exactly what I said, but that I was pessimistic about the Synod. But that's not how I feel. I think I'll share one more thing. When I was in Rome for 10 days in 2018 during the Synod on Young People, which nobody cared about, like, because there was no big, like, what's going to happen. But through some fluke and through some Jesuits that I know, I sort of got in touch with some of the Pope's closest advisors, who were telling me, no, this is actually important. Like, this is one of the most important things, because the Pope doesn't want to lose the next generation of Catholics. Like, he realizes that, in fact, the future of the church, like, depends on us not losing a generation of young people. And so there was such realism at that Synod. If you go back and look at some of the documents, Christus Vivit, Christ Lives, is the document that came out of it. There's a great deal of optimistic realism in it, where he says, the church has lost young people across the world. And they did a really good job of listening to what people actually thought. And it wasn't, there were criticisms that came out of the press that would say, okay, well, they're just the hand-picked, the diocese, the people who are always hanging around church, that's who they got. No, that's actually not true. They had people who were alienated. And when I was in Rome, it was really moving to watch even kind of diffident bishops be won over by the Spirit. Like, when you're together, it's like, if you've ever been on retreat, and you think about the relationship that you develop between different retreatants, like, you go through something even if you can't articulate it. And I think that's what the Pope is kind of hoping we sort of organize ourselves as we're doing, or as Claudia has done, that we sort of say, well, we these, like, I made that campfire analogy, like, we're like these small little sticks. Our job is not to, like, burn the house down. It's just to start catching fire. Like, we don't have to be the biggest flames. That's like the gospel thing too. It's like the mustard seed. So I don't know. It's like we make it much harder than it needs to be, is my point.
So, rooted in your in what you shared with us, Marisa and Dylan, thinking about your experience with kind of maneuvering these spaces for dialogue within the church and then in society, to move the work that you do at Hope Order Institute along. Rooted in that experience, what do you think our next steps are in order to grow as a synodal church? And the same question goes for you, Griffin, rooted in your particular theme, authority and participation. What would you think our next steps are?
Thank you for that question, Claudia. I think what immediately comes to mind is this openness to the process, because I think for a lot of different reasons, it can be like, this like homework that we have to do from the Pope. Like, you got to go do this big group project. You got to make it work. And hopefully we'll all be better for it in the end, but you have no idea how we're seeing through it and how we're trying to wrap our arms around it. And some people are just, I don't care. So I think a spirit of openness to this unknown, which is very challenging, I think, for many people in a time where so much is out of our control in the COVID pandemic, and trying to wrestle with these ideas and being in virtual spaces. But I think this is the invitation to be open, to receive, to give, to share, and to, in that journey, experience what the Spirit has to offer, and to resist those temptations to be cut off and to not engage, and to stay where we are, and to do things the way we've always done things, and listen to the same people and keep on keeping on, not realizing and taking the opportunity to look at things differently.
It's a good question. I think, as I said, I'm sort of straddling between hope and realism, and I believe that that we do need that conversion within the church, that will only come about by opening up, by listening, by deep listening to people, especially those who are marginalized. I'm not sure how much of this is happening in the church, quite frankly. I'd like to have a better sense of how the synod is being put into practice. I go to a parish that's 2 blocks from where I live, and my children are in catechism, and we're regular Sunday communicants, and we've been at this particular parish for a number of years. We haven't been invited into the synod process, and it's not a critique of the pastor or the parish. We haven't been invited to the synod process. We haven't been extended an invitation to participate in ministry. We continue to go, fueled by that hope, but I wonder how much the synod process truly is being applied across the church, based on my own experience. I do believe, I have faith that this is a journey that the Spirit is calling us to, but my sense is that it's going to be a lot messier than the timelines that have been laid out. We're going to probably have to explode those timelines and rethink this over and over again, and it's going to be quite messy. And so I think we have to be open to we have to do some hard thinking as to how we make this really happen.
I think Dylan and Marisa are both correct. I guess I share their realism, also their desire for openness. I don't really know what to say. I guess I could say, from the perspective of, what we're looking for at Commonweal, I can't speak for all of the editors, but I think we have a pretty skeptical view of again, the kind of stuff I was talking about at the beginning, what might emerge from this. That's all very different from my like life as a person of faith, where I don't know why I believe, but I believe, or I don't know why I think that the synod will work is the wrong word, but that more people will get it is because there's this idea, I think, in Christianity, or the ancient idea, interestingly enough, Christianity used to be called the way, the road. There's this idea that you're converted to Christianity not by doctrine, not by intellectual arguments, but by a witness to something good that's happening. So I think it's also like incumbent on us not just to do stuff, which is important, but it also matters where we direct our attention. That's something that I've been finding during the pandemic, is that it's easy to despair if you're, reading the New York Times every day and seeing like case numbers rise or decay as they may be. I went away for the weekend, I went snowboarding, and I came back, the pandemic was over, and all of a sudden we're at war with Russia. And so it's like, this is like, realize also what's going on is that there are editors making these decisions based on what audiences think they want to hear. So, I go back to the gospel a lot, where Jesus says, like, let anyone with ears listen, like, or let anyone with eyes see. Like, where are you looking? Like, where do you think your salvation is going to come from? It'll sound Pollyannish, but it's like, I don't have this like renegade sense that like we need to rip the church down. Like that would be silly of me. That, it's my religion, it's the institution to which I belong. But at the same time, like I shouldn't let power get in the way of authority, if you know what I mean. Like I shouldn't let the people presently in power, because Pope Francis will not be in power forever. Who knows who they'll elect next? That all depends on a lot of things, or who knows who the Holy Spirit will choose next. But I can't, like, I don't know, I feel like I've been saying this for 2 years, that since the pandemic began, like this is a time of great challenge and testing. And it's our job to ask ourselves if we are the people that we say we are. And if we are, like if we do believe in the resurrection of Christ, like we know where to look. So I guess that's all I'll say. Also, let me just add, I'm not good at this. So like, I don't think that but I know what I should be doing at least.
Thank you. And thank you, Dylan, Marisa, and Griffin for this conversation and for the important work that all three of you do for church and society. And so now it's time for all of us to join the conversation. So I invite our Commonweal community to reflect on the following questions. After having reflected on today's conversation, what points were made that you consider to be important to the conversation around synodality? And beyond listening to today's, just in general, rooted also in your own experience, how does the church dialogue with and learn from other sectors of society, the spheres of politics, economics, culture, civil society, and people who live in poverty? And how is the responsibility of lay people promoted? And how do we foster a more synodal approach in our participation and leadership? So we'll take a moment in silence to reflect, and we'll continue the conversation.